investigate a 400-year-old missing persons case, the Lost Colony of Roanoke Island. In 1587, 117 English settlers landed in the New World. Their goal? To establish England's first permanent American colony. Within 3 years of arrival, they vanished, leaving an ominous clue etched in a tree post: Croatoan. Were these Roanoke colonists murdered? Did they die of natural causes, or were they assimilated into Native American tribes? My investigation will take me on an incredible journey across 2 continents. I'll examine the historical record, test new theories, and with DNA science, make a groundbreaking discovery in the case.
This could prove that someone from the Lost Colony survived.
We're digging for the truth,
This is awesome!
and we're going to extremes to do it.
Hi, I'm Josh Bernstein. The colonization of Roanoke Island in the late 16th century marked the very beginning of the British colonial venture in the Americas. Here in England, Queen Elizabeth I wanted to settle the New World, challenging rival Spain's colonies in Florida and the West Indies. Gaining a foothold in the New World for the British meant aiming a little farther to the north, toward America's mid-Atlantic coastline, on the other side of this ocean.
May 8, 1587. Over 100 English pioneers set sail from the port town of Plymouth. Their benefactor, Sir Walter Raleigh, had already commissioned 2 previous expeditions to Roanoke Island. Both groups returned to England with news of the region's potential for settlement. Raleigh entrusted his 3rd expedition to fulfill the Queen's charge, to build England's first permanent colony in the Western Hemisphere.
After many months at sea, Sir Walter Raleigh's 3rd expedition finally reached these waters. The 117 men, women, and children left their larger ships and rowed ashore on small boats like this, called a shallop.
John White, veteran of Raleigh's 2nd Roanoke expedition, would serve as the colony's governor. Traveling with his pregnant daughter Eleanor, White finally arrived along the northern shores of Roanoke Island after nearly 3 months at sea. According to White's recovered letters and journals, the 1587 colonists were determined to succeed, and with good reason. Sir Walter Raleigh had offered 500 acres of virgin American territory to any man willing to colonize this new world. Roanoke Island rests within the outer banks of eastern North Carolina. I've come here to begin my search for the lost colony.
Hey, Nick.
I've asked Nick Lucchetti, archaeologist for the First Colony Foundation, to meet me at the north end of the island.
Hey, this is great. Should we take a look?
Okay.
If I were standing here 420 years ago, what did this place look like?
There's been a significant loss of land due to the rise in the sea level and especially severe erosion at the north end of the island.
So the shoreline was actually out further.
That's right.
How far?
Well, some estimates put it as much as a quarter of a mile.
Quarter mile. So if the colonists were camped anywhere in that quarter mile, we would have lost all evidence of their settlement.
Right, all that archaeological evidence would be lost.
So have archaeologists been able to find any evidence that they settled here?
In fact, archaeological excavations have found evidence of the Roanoke settlements on some high ground.
Wow, Nick.
Nick and I hike into Fort Raleigh National Forest,
We chose this area.
last known address of the lost colony. For over 20 years, this is where Nick and other archaeologists have collected evidence of the Raleigh expeditions.
So we dug a series of test holes and test trenches in this area.
Right here.
Right around us, yes.
Wow. I mean, this wouldn't look to me like an archaeological site. Did you find anything?
If you hold out your hands, I will put some of the artifacts that we found.
Okay.
Here. Lead ball, piece of flint, a very tiny piece of a crucible, and these are 2 shards of a Spanish olive jar.
So these would be from Sir Walter Raleigh's expeditions.
That's right.
That's amazing. Wouldn't it seem like if 115, 116 people were living here, you'd find more than this?
You would think so. It doesn't appear that this was the village site. However, we do need to do more work here. The search continues for the lost colonists.
For over 100 years, archaeologists have been digging on Roanoke Island and throughout eastern North Carolina in search of the lost colony. The few artifacts that have been recovered to date don't tell us much about the colonists' experiences on the island. But one item, discovered over 50 miles away in a 16th century Indian stronghold, points to how far afield the settlers may have journeyed. This ring. This signet ring bears the insignia of Master Kindle, who we know was on Sir Walter Raleigh's 1585 expedition. It was found on Croatan, later known as Hatteras Island. The question is, how did it get there? Did he lose it? Did he trade it? Or was he killed for it? To answer these questions, I need to understand what life was really like for the colonists more than 400 years ago. Fortunately, there is an English colony whose experiences in the New World mirrors that of the Roanoke settlements. I'm heading 150 miles north to Jamestown, Virginia. Established in 1607, Jamestown became England's first permanent American colony, nearly 20 years after the Roanoke colony disappeared. Both Jamestown and Roanoke shared one common problem: hostile Indian neighbors. To protect their settlements from attack, the English created wooden fortifications known as palisades. To find out just how important these barricades were to the basic survival of the colonists, I'm going to meet historic Jamestown's senior archaeologist, Dr. Bill Kelso. He and his staff are building a palisade wall using the same tools available to the Jamestown colonists in the early 17th century.
Making a palisade.
We're hard at it, yes, sir.
You guys mind if I interrupt? Just
Not
take
at
a look?
all. Give us a hand. It's really good, tight.
In theory, erecting a palisade is simple. Tree trunks are split, placed upright in a trench, and connected by wooden pegs driven through crossbeams.
An electric drill would be nice. It would.
In practice, building a palisade was a massive undertaking. In 1607, the men in the camp labored for weeks before completing the nearly 1,000-foot-long barricade at Jamestown.
20 years earlier, when they were on Roanoke Island, would they have been making palisades there?
Yeah, and they'd be doing the same thing. The people that tried that settlement also had experience of fighting in wars in Europe, and they were doing palisades like this there.
Okay.
Now it's my turn to do some heavy lifting. Bill and his team will show me just how hard it was to build these immense structures at the time. When John White returned to Roanoke Island in 1587, he was able to repair and reconstruct the palisade left behind by Raleigh's second expedition. But in 1607, the Jamestown settlers had to start from scratch. Constructing Jamestown's palisade required harvesting 600 oak and walnut trees and splitting them into over 1,500 15-foot-tall posts. Based on written accounts from the first settlers, working with rudimentary tools like these took a heavy toll on the Jamestown colonists. I've been working here for only a few minutes and I'm already starting to feel it.
Coming through? Do you know, Bill, how long it would take to put together a palisade?
Took them 19 days on record to do the entire fort.
That's maybe 20 men erecting nearly 80 posts or 50 feet of palisade per day. Hard work, but these barriers were essential to the protection of the English settlers. Within these wooden walls, a small group of colonists could build homes, store vital provisions, and defend themselves from Indian attack. Buried 3 to 4 feet into the earth, these giant fences were able to withstand hurricane winds.
I think it's solid. Give it a test. Push on it. A little loose, but I think it'll tighten up when the ground gets solid.
So I understand the connection with the palisades, but what other connections are there between Jamestown and Roanoke?
Well, when the first colonists came in here in 1607, the Jamestown colonists, they were instructed to look for the lost colonists if they could find them.
What'd they find?
Well, when they first got here, and along the river, they spied a blonde-headed, light-skinned young boy. Then they sent some parties down to the south to see if they could find more, and they did run into some Native Americans who said they had seen clothed men in that area, which means Englishmen.
Oh, really? So there's a possibility that 20 years later, some people were still alive.
I think so. I really do.
The great Indian chief Powhatan, father of Pocahontas, boasted that he had slaughtered the Roanoke colonists years before. But rumors of their existence continued to circulate among the natives. Could some colonists have survived the slaughter? Was the word Croatoan etched into the Roanoke palisade an indication of where they went? I'm on a quest to find the lost colony of Roanoke Island, over 100 English settlers who vanished in 1587. I traveled by shallop boat to the north end of the island only to discover a limited record of the colonists' existence. At the Jamestown settlement, I learned that the first search party sent to find the colonists returned with stories of their survival. But if the English did leave Roanoke Island, where did they go and why? To gain a better perspective, I'm taking my search for the lost colony in an entirely new direction. Up. I've asked my old friend Bubba Peters to join me at Roanoke Island.
Great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too, man.
Using Bubba's PPG, or powered paraglider, I plan to get a view of the island from above. Together, we're going to fly over Roanoke and eastern North Carolina. Getting an aerial view will allow us to examine the island's geography, the colonists' surroundings, and their possible departure points into the mainland or even the Outer Banks.
The things we do in search of adventure. Prop clear.
There's the north end of the island. We know from the archaeological record the 1587 colonists didn't leave many clues behind at the settlement site. And from this perspective, Roanoke appears to be too small to support a permanent and lasting English colony. The Albemarle Sound to the north, the Pamlico Sound to the south, the Outer Banks to the east, the North Carolina mainland to the west. It's clear the Roanoke colonists would have had easy access to all these points, and many historians agree that they eventually would have abandoned Roanoke Island. But in the late 16th century, warring Indian tribes dominated eastern North Carolina. Leaving the confines of the island could have cost the settlers their lives.
Man, I tell you, if you want to go and explore Roanoke or this area, that is a great way to do it. I mean, the clouds over the island, it was magical. And I could really get a feel for just how much water is leading. Obviously it's an island, so there's water, but just the number of waterways leading out from this place. It's obvious why it's been so hard to figure out where the lost colony went.
But we do know where they started. Retracing the steps of the 16th century settlers, my investigation takes me back to the last known address of the lost colony, Fort Raleigh.
Well, as you can see, it's getting dark and Fort Raleigh is officially closed now. But my friends at the Park Service have been kind enough to let me actually sleep here tonight. I picked a great spot just over here, and I brought some materials which the colonists would have had. Just canvas and wool for bedding. And I don't really have much of an agenda except to experience what camping and living here would be like. This place is totally new to me, and it was totally new to them. So I'm gonna set up camp and just see how it goes.
The 117 colonists from Raleigh's third expedition consisted of gentlemen, soldiers, servants, women, and children. Few had ever left the confines of England, let alone settled another continent. They arrived deep in the summer season with limited supplies, surrounded by Indians, and with winter fast approaching. Before wooden homes could be constructed, many colonists would have used tents as shelter. I hope by spending the night, as they did over 400 years ago, I might gain some insight into the English settlers' thoughts and feelings.
Good evening. It's now 2 hours after sunset. As you can tell, it's pretty dark out. I'm all alone at Fort Raleigh, holding down the fort, so to speak, trying to get a sense of what the colonists might have felt when they were here 420 years ago. We'll see how it goes. But I think that the people who were coming to this new world were incredibly adventurous and were willing to sign up for an experience well beyond their imagination. They didn't know the terrain. They didn't know if the natives were hostile or friendly. They didn't know if they could survive long enough to actually grow their own food and become self-sustaining. And as I'm spending my first night here, completely unknowing, don't know what's out here, don't know how it's going to go, I got to give them credit. That's impressive that they would go all the way to the other end of the world and start a new life.
Sir Walter Raleigh's third expedition did take hold here on Roanoke Island. According to Governor John White's surviving accounts, they established homes, and in less than 1 month they were rewarded with a new addition to the settlement. White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was delivered, becoming the first English child born in America. I asked Fort Raleigh interpreter Rob Bowling to give me a wake-up call the next morning.
Morning, Josh.
Oh, hey, Rob.
How'd you sleep?
I eat a man.
Sure.
I slept well. It was quiet. It was really peaceful. It was actually really nice. It definitely gives me a sense of like this space, just the tranquility. And I'm sure that some of those colonists who were camping for the first time and were from big cities would be in for a totally new experience.
Quite a stark contrast in lifestyle. They didn't know it also, but it was among the driest years.
Really, so
On
finding
record.
water would have been a challenge for them.
Yeah.
It's an intriguing thought.
Yeah.
To better understand the climatic conditions the 16th century settlers faced, I've contacted archaeologist Dennis Blanton.
Hi, Dennis.
He's instructed me to meet him at the entrance of a local swamp and to wear rubber boots.
Ready to go?
Yeah, got my boots.
Got your boots?
My other boots.
We'll pile in, we'll shove off.
All right.
Dennis's unique
Beautiful
study
piece
of
of
the
water.
cypress trees in the mid-Atlantic region has yielded some fascinating clues regarding the climate conditions the Roanoke colonists faced.
So, Dennis, what are we going to do when we get there?
We'll pick our tree,
Yeah.
and the rings of that tree has a story to tell.
That story will relate to the Lost Colony.
It can. What we have to do is take a sample of those rings, and not only do we count the number of rings so that we can determine the age of the tree, but we also measure the widths of those rings.
So the wider the ring, the wetter the year.
That's exactly right.
Which tree are we going to?
It's this large tree about 100 feet in.
As we work our way deeper into the swamp, it's obvious why Dennis suggested the rubber boots. He's also provided me with climbing gear so we can scale the cypress tree.
Okay,
But first, we need to get to it.
watch your step. Pretty good mud, huh?
That is nice mud. Ooh. It's kind of squishy.
Keep going, Josh. Not much farther.
All right.
And here is our tree.
Dennis has brought me to this cypress tree to take a core sample.
To get a little above this.
By boring into the heart of this centuries-old giant, we can collect a cylindrical core that illustrates the water conditions over the tree's lifespan.
length of rope called a lanyard.
Dennis explains that the best place to core this cypress is some 10 feet up from the base. Since I've never climbed a tree with spikes and a harness, Dennis shows me how it's done.
That makes sense.
Yeah, well, you know, it looks okay. Let's see how it actually goes. Okay. I think I'm okay. I'm in a good spot now. There we go. Okay.
Got it.
Wow, I can see what you mean about those spikes having to be really tight. This is some work.
Good job. Got below your lanyard.
All right. Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
Josh, welcome. What we have here is a tool called an increment borer, and it's essentially a hand-turned drill. You want to aim for the center of the tree.
Last time I did this, I used an electric drill. I'm starting to slide.
This will make you appreciate that electric drill a little more.
All right.
We have this piece that's called the extractor.
Yep.
You should take that, don't drop it, push that in,
Okay.
feed it
Gently.
gently. Now you want to pull the extractor gently outward, and you should have a core.
I don't know, Dennis. I'm not doing it right. And this is not easy to stand up here this long.
Yeah. There you go.
Wow.
Look at that. It's a beauty.
It's a worm.
It's a great core.
We decide to head back to solid ground to discover what the core can teach us.
Yeah. Oh, thank God. My whole body, I figure 180 pounds, is being sent into the tree on these little spikes. Hurts.
For over 20 years, Dennis has collected core samples just like this one throughout the mid-Atlantic.
And here, my friend, are the pieces.
Okay.
Have to reassemble these in the proper sequence.
Working with colleagues at the University of Arkansas, he's developed a master sequence of climate conditions on Roanoke Island, spanning 800 years.
What can you tell me about the conditions that the settlers faced?
The worst drought in the last 800 years in this region occurred between 1587 and 1589,
Oh, really?
which is precisely the last attempt to settle Roanoke Colony.
So any attempt that the settlers would have made to farm or to even just provide a livelihood would have been a real challenge. So this could explain some of the conditions that led to the colony getting lost.
That's right.
You can learn all that just from studying tree rings.
That's exactly right.
That's incredible.
Less than 1 month after their arrival, the Roanoke colonists were forced to confront some harsh realities. John White returned to England for emergency provisions. According to his writings, he resisted but ultimately agreed to leave. His daughter Eleanor and newborn granddaughter Virginia would be left behind. Governor White would never see either of them again. I'm investigating one of the oldest missing person cases in American history, the Lost Colony of Roanoke Island. I've flown above the island looking for clues to where the English settlers could have gone. And I've discovered that the Roanoke region was suffering one of the worst droughts in 800 years. In August 1587, the colonists urged their governor, John White, to return to England for much-needed supplies.
John White left the settlers and his family promising to return quickly from England with more provisions. He hoped it would take 3 months. It actually took him 3 years.
In 1587, as the Spanish Armada prepared to wage war against England, the Crown requisitioned all available ships for the war effort. The Roanoke colony was effectively cut off. In August 1590, White finally returned to the settlement site. He found it abandoned. His only lead, a single word carved into a post, Croatoan. According to his writings, this one Indian word restored White's hope that the colony and his family had survived. To find out why, I'm leaving Roanoke Island and heading over 250 miles southwest to attend a Native American powwow in Lumberton, North Carolina. I've been invited here by Dr. David Levere, professor of Native American Studies from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington.
So how is it that the word Croatoan would bring us here to an Indian powwow?
Well, Croatoan was an island, or that was the name of an island in the Outer Banks. And the people that live there, the Croatans, are the ancestors of these people here that we call the Lumbee.
The Lumbee are the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi River.
Ruffle dance! Today is a good day to be native.
The over 40,000 member community resides primarily in south-central North Carolina. But 400 years ago, their Croatan ancestors were a coastal people. Written accounts from Raleigh's early expeditions, together with Master Kindle's signet ring found on Croatoan, have convinced some historians that the Indians living there befriended the English, traded with them, and protected them. Croatoan, now called Hatteras, belongs to the chain of coastal islands known as the Outer Banks. If the 1587 colonists relocated there, John White believed their safety would have been assured thanks to one man, Manteo. Manteo, a Croatan Indian chief, met White during Raleigh's previous expeditions to Roanoke Island. Assisting the English caused Manteo and the Croatan Indians to become blood enemies of rival tribes. But Manteo saw long-term advantages to feeding and protecting the colonists.
He had more or less said that my future lies with the English and I'm going to help them. I'm going to ally with them. And it would be a very good alliance if it worked out. He would get economic benefits, he would get military benefits, he would have good allies against some growing confederacies around him. So this could be a very good thing for Manteo and the Croatoans.
So the colonists would look to Manteo naturally for some sort of support.
It was good for him to make sure that they survived. He had essentially allied himself with a very powerful European nation. If Manteo could make these people into kin, then he could become a very big power in this part of the country.
But Governor John White would never reach Croatoan Island. Following a terrible storm, his rescue ship was cast back into the Atlantic Ocean. He was forced to return to England. While the evidence that the Roanoke colonists moved to Croatoan is slim, their motivation to join the natives would have been powerful. More than just protection, the Croatan Indians could have taught the English how to survive. To understand just how much vital knowledge the Indians possessed, I've asked an old friend to meet me at Roanoke Island.
Great to see you.
Steve Watts of the Shield Museum in Gastonia, North Carolina, is a leading authority in American Aboriginal studies.
What was life like here for the natives in the late 16th century?
These people were living in an incredibly diverse, rich environment. And they understood it. They understood the maritime forest and all the resources there, and they knew how to extract a living from that in all sorts of conditions.
So if the colonists arrived here, it was pretty much the worst time. It's a drought. They don't know the area at all. Sounds like they would have a lot to learn from the natives.
Well, it was really essential to their survival.
Wow. Nice spread you brought.
Well, let's take a look.
All right.
This gives you a pretty good example of the diversity of the toolkit of the people living here. Their ability to use the stone, the bone, the shell, the wood, all the things in this environment in order to live and not just survive, but, you know, have a pretty sophisticated life here.
They're able to create a whole lifestyle, a very rich lifestyle without any metal at all.
Right. The basis of the whole technology is stone. Whether it's in this axe or the knife or a simple flake tool. And of course the arrow points. We always think about the arrowheads, the arrow points. And, you know,
Native Americans used bows and arrows to hunt, but they also used them for defense. The 16th century colonists' main means of defense was the musket. Who would win a head-to-head battle in terms of speed?
So let's say you're the colonial person with a musket and I'm the native with the arrow. How many arrows can I get into you before you fire your round?
I think you get 5 or 6, I really do.
5 or 6 to 1. We should put the advantage with the natives when it came to killing each other. What about food? I see you got corn here. What else would be
Well, they're
going on?
growing corn, beans, squash, and some other things in their gardens, and they're doing multi-cropping.
But if it's a drought, that would be pretty hard for them to be growing things.
They were still hunter-gatherers. They could always fall back on that. When a crop goes bad, you can go to the wild resources.
They could go to the waters here and hunt.
Sure.
John White's illustrations confirm what Steve says. They clearly demonstrate local Indians spearfishing and crabbing for food. And they cook their catch on grills constructed from tree limbs. Steve's brought along a collection of seafood native to Roanoke Island, and together we're going to grill it, Indian style.
That'll do. So Steve, it looks like we got ourselves a pretty fine meal. Now the natives had the knowledge, they knew where the resources existed.
Right.
If the colonists didn't, and they were cut off from their supply lines, would they have been able to reach out for this kind of knowledge?
Well, this is what they would have had to know in order to survive. This was about survival. The natives had the technology. You have to adapt.
Shrimp?
Yeah.
All right. Pretty good.
Good.
I've traveled the mid-Atlantic United States searching for any evidence the Roanoke colony of 1587 may have survived. At an Indian powwow, I learned that the native chief Manteo could have protected the colonists and moved them to his island home along the Outer Banks, Croatoan. But one historian has taken this theory in a new direction. While convinced Manteo harbored some of the English, he asserts the majority of the colonists moved into the mainland of North Carolina. Dr. James Horn of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation has asked me to join him on a motorboat ride across the Albemarle Sound, traveling due west of Roanoke Island. Drawing from historical accounts penned by early Roanoke and Jamestown settlers, Jim has constructed a new theory he believes best explains the last known whereabouts of the lost colony.
So Jim, it's 1587 and the colonists leave Roanoke Island. Why?
They were probably running out of food. They were surrounded by hostile Indians, so they had to move.
Does everyone go to Croatoan Island?
Of Croatoan Island wouldn't have supported 116 settlers. I think some did go there, and maybe between 15 and 25, but the rest, the main body, headed inland.
Wouldn't they want to stay close to Croatoan Island so they could be found? I mean, why head far inland?
Just before John White left for England, at the end of August 1587, the colonists told him that they were going to head 50 miles into the main. That would bring them directly westwards from Roanoke Island up to the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers.
We better get going then.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Our trip from Roanoke Island to Bachelor Bay on the western edge of the Albemarle Sound spans just over 50 miles. Jim explains Sir Walter Raleigh's second expedition to Roanoke Island discovered another Indian community, the Chowanokes, during a scouting trip into the interior. These Indians were also willing to support the English settlers, and their location was ideal. It provided interior protection from Spanish naval attack, better land for planting, fresh drinking water, and a partnership with the native people. But Jim also believes that the English had a more personal reason for leaving Roanoke Island: greed.
What would have brought the colonists out this far?
Well, I think the lost colonists had picked up rumors of gold in the interior, and this would have been a perfect base in which to prospect.
Rumors of gold, passed on by members of the previous Roanoke expeditions, turned out to be false. But Jim believes the idea of striking it rich sparked the first American gold rush. If the Roanoke settlers headed west into the interior and joined with native communities, could there be living descendants today? Some experts believe Native Americans, like the Lumbee, absorbed the members of the lost colony into their tribes. I'm reminded of something Dr. David Levere mentioned at the Lumbee powwow. He said that the act of merging diverse cultures was very common among the Indian people.
When we look at European society, we stress the individual. In Indian society, they stress the community. So Indian people would go out of their way to adopt outsiders, bring in strangers, and make them into family.
That actually might explain why some of the people that I'm seeing here at the Lumbee powwow don't look to me like typical Native Americans.
Indian people are very inclusive. They're married and intermarried, and you get this wonderful Indian community. It looks very different, but they're all Indian.
So it is possible that the colonists would have assimilated, and that's why they disappeared.
I firmly believe that.
Today, elders tell me that over 40 surnames of the original 1587 colonists can be found among the Lumbee people. Could genealogy, rather than archaeology, be the key to unlocking the mystery of the Roanoke colonists? Searching through local North Carolina records, I discovered an interesting article about a 19th century man named Malachi Payne. Payne told his children and grandchildren he was a descendant of a 1587 lost colonist. His name? Henry Payne. Local records place the Payne family name in eastern North Carolina for over 350 years. As part of my search, I've come to Fairway Drive to meet a possible descendant of Henry Payne.
Chris Payne Sr.?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Josh. We spoke on the phone.
Hey, Josh.
Chris Payne has been able to trace his family history to a Thomas Payne Sr., born in the early 1700s.
Start right here. This is actually my dad when he was a little boy.
Roughly 4 generations after Henry Payne arrived in America.
Okay.
He's invited me to his home to take a closer look at his records.
My son did a lot of work in the local records here, and then this is the old family Bible. Mm-hmm. So we tried to match up the work that he found on the family trees over the internet and places like that with what we had in the Bible.
So the people in your family who own this Bible wrote their names in it?
Yes, and passed it down from generation to generation until it finally got to my dad and then to me.
Wow.
My independent researchers confirm Chris's genealogy does date back 300 years. But to tie his bloodline to Henry Payne, I need to use a more scientific approach: DNA.
You've done an impressive job actually tracking your genealogy. I think that this research and the internet as a resource is incredibly powerful, but the only definitive proof would be DNA. And actually, I brought with me a DNA swab kit. And if you're willing, I'd take a sample, and we can use that DNA marker to determine if you're actually related to Henry Payne, who was part of the Lost Colony.
Oh, that's great.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
On average, the Y chromosome test I'm giving Chris can track his unique DNA up to 750 years through the Payne male line. Not only with his ancestors here in America, but also in Europe. If Chris Payne and a living male descendant of Henry Payne were to possess matching DNA, we could finally prove someone from the lost colony survived. I'm taking Chris's sample with me on the last leg of my journey. England. Here in the United Kingdom, I'll seek a living descendant of the lost colonist Henry Payne and match his DNA to Chris Payne of North Carolina. Teaming up with one of the world's leading genetic experts, we'll attempt to solve this nearly 420-year-old mystery once and for all. I'm investigating one of the oldest mysteries in American history, the Lost Colony of Roanoke Island. So far, I've explored by water, by air, even by tree, in search of clues that might shed light on their disappearance and possible survival. I've recently discovered that the Roanoke colonists may have assimilated into Indian communities, but no evidence of a living descendant has ever come to light until now. I may have located a possible descendant of the lost colony. I'm heading back to England, where the voyage of Sir Walter Raleigh's 1587 expedition began. With the help of scientists there, I hope to make an historic breakthrough. If the Roanoke colonists survived, then Henry Payne, a member of the third expedition to the island, might have direct descendants in America, some who might even be alive today. Meeting Chris Payne brought me face to face with the possibility he may be one of them. But to prove it, I need to match Chris's DNA sample with the DNA from a known male descendant of Henry Payne in England. Dr. Nick Barrett, one of England's leading genealogists, has been helping me search for Henry's relatives.
Hey there, Josh.
He's asked me to meet him in a small hamlet in Suffolk called Nowton.
This is Nowton? Yeah, welcome to the middle of nowhere. Beautiful part of the country, but I brought you here for a reason.
Yeah.
It turns out that the Payne family that we've been tracking originates in this area, and they can be connected directly with sponsors of colonists and the people that they took across back in the 16th century.
Okay.
Unfortunately, they're very elusive. I've been tracking them down through time, but they seem to either die childless, or the male heirs die out very early, or they all have girls who marry and the surname disappears, which means we can't actually come forward that much.
Because the Y chromosome that we need would only pass through men.
Exactly. Well, you'd think after all the troubles looking 100...
Nick has brought me here to the church in Nowton. Between 1540 and 1620, it was owned by the Payne family. Henry Payne himself may have worshipped here over 400 years ago. Although Nick has yet to find evidence of surviving male descendants here in England, I haven't given up the search. I've had Chris Payne's DNA sample sent to Oxford Ancestors, one of the world's top genetic laboratories. And then I went a step further. To improve our odds, I've added DNA samples from two other Payne men from eastern North Carolina, both with male lines tracing back 300 years in the Roanoke area. Their names are Michael and Donald. Next, I contacted the Payne Family DNA Project. This independent group has cataloged the DNA results of nearly 100 individuals whose surnames are Payne, not only from the US, but also from the United Kingdom. Their findings were made available to researchers at Oxford Ancestors. I'm meeting their founder and professor of genetics, Dr. Brian Sykes, to review the DNA results. Using 10 key DNA markers, he's compared our 3 North Carolina subjects with those from the Payne Family DNA Project. He uses numeric values to indicate a Y chromosome match or mismatch.
So what do you got for me?
Donald and Chris were exact matches right the way across. These two, Chris and Donald, are closely related, and Michael isn't.
But it's Michael Payne's DNA signature that proves the most intriguing. When his DNA was compared with a Payne family subject, James Payne from Scotland, the bells went off.
We have now this other man, James, who comes from Scotland. He doesn't match with Chris or Donald, but he does match with Michael. They have a common paternal ancestor who might have been living within the last 500 years or something like that.
The male line of James Payne traces back over 800 years in the United Kingdom. And we know that Michael Payne's dates back 300 years in eastern North Carolina.
How can we relate their common ancestor to the colonization of Roanoke Island?
One of James's ancestors must have gone to America. Then it looks as though the first colonists to the island, if they were related to James, are also related to Michael.
Michael and James link up genetically, and they share a 16th century English ancestor.
which could have been one of the colonists.
Could have been Henry himself, yes.
This could prove that someone from the Lost Colony survived.
You've got a good match here. I mean, these are rare chromosomes. It's highly significant. And I can tell you, it doesn't happen every time. So, congratulations on finding the right people.
Thanks, thank you, thank you.
A breakthrough in the case.
Pleasure.
With the help of DNA scientists, digging for the truth has made a compelling connection. A genetic link to the past across 2 continents, creating the foundation for future investigations into the Lost Colony and its survivors. Having suffered through a drought and with limited resources, the Raleigh settlers of 1587 could have merged with Indian tribes and learned the native skills of survival. We've taken an extraordinary leap forward using DNA science to find them. But the search for the Roanoke colonists continues. Perhaps a living descendant will be confirmed in our lifetime, and the nearly 420-year-old mystery will finally be solved.
...116 people were living here. You'd find more than this?
You would think so. It doesn't appear that this was the village site. However, we do need to do more work here. The search continues for the lost colonists.
For over 100 years, archaeologists have been digging on Roanoke Island and throughout eastern North Carolina in search of the lost colony. The few artifacts that have been recovered to date don't tell us much about the colonists' experiences on the island. But one item, discovered over 50 miles away in a 16th century Indian stronghold, points to how far afield the settlers may have journeyed. This ring.
This signet ring bears the insignia of Master Kindle, who we know was on Sir Walter Raleigh's 1585 expedition. It was found on Croatan, later known as Hatteras Island. The question is, how did it get there? Did he lose it? Did he trade it? Or was he killed for it?
To answer these questions, I need to understand what life was really like for the colonists more than 400 years ago. Fortunately, there is an English colony whose experiences in the New World mirrors that of the Roanoke settlements. I'm heading 150 miles north to Jamestown, Virginia. Established in 1607, Jamestown became England's first permanent American colony, nearly 20 years after the Roanoke colony disappeared. Both Jamestown and Roanoke shared one common problem: hostile Indian neighbors. To protect their settlements from attack, the English...
Hey, Nick.
I've asked Nick Lucchetti, archaeologist for the First Colony Foundation, to meet me at the north end of the island.
Hey, this is great. Should we take a look?
Okay.
If I were standing here 420 years ago, what did this place look like?
There's been a significant loss of land due to the rise in the sea level and especially severe erosion at the north end of the island.
So the shoreline was actually out further?
That's right.
How far?
Well, some estimates put it as much as a quarter of a mile.
Quarter mile. So if the colonists were camped anywhere in that quarter mile, we would have lost all evidence of their settlement.
Right. All that archaeological evidence would be lost.
So have archaeologists been able to find any evidence that they settled here?
In fact, the archaeological excavations have found evidence of the Roanoke settlements on some high ground.
Wow, Nick.
Nick and I hike into Fort Raleigh National Forest,
We chose this area.
last known address of the lost colony. For over 20 years, this is where Nick and other archaeologists have collected evidence of the Raleigh expeditions.
So we dug a series of test holes and test trenches in this area.
Right here?
Right around us, yes.
Wow. I mean, this wouldn't look to me like an archaeological site. Did you find anything?
If you hold out your hands, I will put some of the artifacts that we found.
Okay.
Here. Lead ball, piece of flint, a very tiny piece of a crucible, and these are 2 sherds of a Spanish olive jar.
So these would be from Sir Walter Raleigh's expeditions?
That's right.
That's amazing. Wouldn't it seem like if 115...
1587. Over 100 English pioneers set sail from the port town of Plymouth. Their benefactor, Sir Walter Raleigh, had already commissioned 2 previous expeditions to Roanoke Island. Both groups returned to England with news of the region's potential for settlement. Raleigh entrusted his 3rd expedition to fulfill the Queen's charge. to build England's first permanent colony in the Western Hemisphere.
After many months at sea, Sir Walter Raleigh's third expedition finally reached these waters. The 117 men, women, and children left their larger ships and rowed ashore on small boats like this, called a shallop.
John White, veteran of Raleigh's second Roanoke expedition, would serve as the colony's governor. Traveling with his pregnant daughter Eleanor, White finally arrived along the northern shores of Roanoke Island after nearly 3 months at sea. According to White's recovered letters and journals, the 1587 colonists were determined to succeed, and with good reason. Sir Walter Raleigh had offered 500 acres of virgin American territory to any man willing to colonize this new world. Roanoke Island rests within the outer banks of eastern North Carolina. I've come here to begin my search for the lost colony. Investigate a 400-year-old missing persons case, the Lost Colony of Roanoke Island. In 1587, 117 English settlers landed in the New World. Their goal? To establish England's first permanent American colony. Within 3 years of arrival, they vanished, leaving an ominous clue etched in a tree post. Croatoan. Were these Roanoke colonists murdered? Did they die of natural causes, or were they assimilated into Native American tribes? My investigation will take me on an incredible journey across 2 continents. I'll examine the historical record, test new theories, and with DNA science, make a groundbreaking discovery in the case.
This could prove that someone from the lost colony survived.
We're digging for the truth,
This is awesome!
and we're going to extremes to do it.
Hi, I'm Josh Bernstein. The colonization of Roanoke Island in the late 16th century marked the very beginning of the British colonial venture in the Americas. Here in England, Queen Elizabeth I wanted to settle the New World, challenging rival Spain's colonies in Florida and the West Indies. Gaining a foothold in the New World for the British meant aiming a little farther to the north, toward America's mid-Atlantic coastline, on the other side of this ocean.
May created wooden fortifications known as palisades. To find out just how important these barricades were to the basic survival of the colonists, I'm going to meet historic Jamestown's senior archaeologist, Dr. Bill Kelso. He and his staff are building a palisade wall using the same tools available to the Jamestown colonists in the early 17th century.
Making a palisade.
We're hard at it, yes, sir.
Do you guys mind if I interrupt? Just
Not
take
at
a look?
all. Give us a hand. It's really good, tight.
In theory, erecting a palisade is simple. Tree trunks are split, placed upright in a trench, and connected by wooden pegs driven through crossbeams.
An electric drill would be nice.
In practice, building a palisade was a massive undertaking. In 1607, the men in the camp labored for weeks before completing the nearly 1,000-foot-long barricade at Jamestown.
20 years earlier, when they were on Roanoke Island, would they have been making palisades there?
Yeah, they'd be doing the same thing. The people that tried that settlement also had experience of fighting in wars in Europe, and they were doing palisades like this there.
Okay.
Now it's my turn to do some heavy lifting. Bill and his team will show me just how hard it was to build these immense structures at the time. When John White returned to Roanoke Island in 1587, he was able to repair and reconstruct the palisade left behind by Raleigh's second expedition. But in 1607, the Jamestown settlers had to start from scratch. Constructing Jamestown's palisade required hard